Welcome to the Art of Procurement podcast. I'm Philip Eidson, a 20-year procurement practitioner, former head of procurement, advisor to procurement leaders around the world, and the founder and managing director of Art of Procurement. My team and I work with our global network of subject matter experts to help companies elevate procurement's impact, whether that's through building and implementing transformation programs, sustainably reducing external expenses, or leveraging AOP Mastermind, our learning and development platform for companies of all sizes. You're listening to our flagship podcast, where we pull back the curtain and shine a light on the strategies, tactics, and tools that leading procurement teams are using to align their results with the needs of the business. Hi there everybody, welcome to today's Art of Procurement podcast. And with this being the first episode of the month, I am joined as always by Kelly Barner, owner and managing director of Buyers Meeting Point and general manager here at Art of Procurement. So Kelly, thank you for joining me.
Hey Phil, thanks so much for having me back.
So here we are just entering May 2020.
Yeah.
What are you seeing as we kind of come out of April into May right now?
Well, I think I have to start by saying an expression my grandmother used to say is, see you later, April. Don't let the door hit you in the rear on your way out. I think we're done, right? This has been tough. Everybody has risen to the challenge, but this has been a tough 4, 8, potentially even longer weeks, depending on where in the world you happen to be based.
Yeah.
And it's been particularly difficult for a lot of individuals whose jobs have been impacted because their role has shifted. They're facing, new communications or teamwork challenges. And in fact, we have a really interesting conversation coming up that you had with Mark Holyoke about what it's like if you either happen to be in the middle of a job move right now, or if you are a hiring manager attempting to interview and compare candidates under these circumstances.
Yeah, Mark and I spoke earlier in the week, and that's going to play, I think, a week today, so next Monday. One of the things that I see as we're moving into May is kind of the end of April is this, I don't want to say turning point, because that could allude to a bunch of different things, outside of the world of procurement. But the thought that there's an adaptation to this new normal. Whatever this new normal looks like, but the focus on, okay, we have been running around like headless chickens for the last 2 months trying to secure as much supply as we can, and that isn't going to end tomorrow. But I talk to a lot more companies now who are saying, okay, what do I do next? And honestly, that's one of the reasons why we've been focusing a lot on expense management and risk, whether it's the expense management through the expense management hub that we put together and the content that we built. We're also seeing it from a consulting perspective within our practice, and also risk. I've been working with ISM actually on developing a webinar from a risk perspective, and how can we start thinking about how to really more proactively manage risk in our supply chain. So companies more and more, I think, are turning to those modes and out of firefighting mode.
Yeah. Well, and if there's a silver lining, think back to all of the topics that we've discussed over the last years, really, kind of the central theme has been, why does nothing ever change for procurement? We talk about transformation. We talk about all these different types of strategic plans. Well, here we are. Here's the silver lining. Yeah. Literally now everything is different. The entire landscape is being changed. And so if we were looking for change, oh boy, did we get it.
Right. Yeah. And it's such a time where we can use that responsibly. Like, it's a time to shine, but that doesn't necessarily mean doing the things that we have always done. How we handle this is really going to drive, I think, the future of the profession. Because we've been asking for this spotlight in a lot of companies. That's not to say in other companies, I don't want to paint a broad brush here, but a number of organizations have been looking for that place in the spotlight, and now it's here. It's our time to stand up and lead.
Absolutely. And anytime this much change is going on, there are absolutely both long-term effects and huge opportunities for the individuals and teams that are ready to stand up and seize them.
Yeah. So let's go into today's conversation. And you and I both just spoke with Brian Seipel, who is a consultant and spend analysis lead at Corcentric. Well, Corcentric is a leading provider of procurement and finance solutions that transform how companies purchase, pay, and get paid. And they're also members of the Art of Procurement Experts on Demand ecosystem, and they're sponsors of our once a month Ask the Expert series. And so in today's conversation, Kelly and I discussed with Brian ways in which an organization can identify quick wins when building out a savings opportunity wave plan. So without further ado, I'm going to roll the tape, and with my first question to Brian, which is, did you find procurement, or did procurement find you?
I would say that procurement definitely found me. My tenure really started in the sales and marketing side of business. Pretty early on, my boss had asked me, "Hey, we need to look at this new thing called a CRM, and how about you go and find one?"
Right.
So nothing I was overly familiar with as a kid fresh out of school, but really helped my company find the right CRM tool and implement it. So really, I've been in procurement a pretty long time alongside the sales and marketing side of the house.
All right, and it's always interesting when you get that background from outside of procurement. I think it helps maybe contextualize some of the things that you're doing and maybe more empathize with some of the stakeholders and some of the challenges that they feel when they have frustrations in working with procurement.
You know what really does? It gives you a chance to see things from the other side of the fence. It's one thing to look for supplier relationships and what works from a procurement standpoint. It's an entirely different thing to be a stakeholder on the front lines and having to actually rely on those relationships. So I think it's good to see both sides of the fence.
Well, the conversation that we really teed up for today, and it's something that I think is really important, especially where we are now as organizations are kind of looking towards what's next. And, as they all kind of grapple with all the impact of the coronavirus, is how to really think about identifying and defining quick wins from a cost savings, expense reduction perspective. And I wondered, this is something that you do day in, day out. You have an awful lot of experience in this. So I just wonder if you could share maybe some guiding tips, if you will, onto how to think about building an opportunity assessment and building a wave plan.
Certainly. And where I typically start, just as a bit of background on me, a large part of what I do at Corcentric is spend analysis and opportunity assessment.
Mm-hmm.
So where I typically will recommend starting is doing that full spend analysis, making sure that we see an entire population of spends. We can really start looking for opportunities across the board. When it comes to finding specific strategies or levers, a big bread and butter tool that a lot of procurement relies on is supplier consolidation. It gives you that carrot and stick. The carrot being, hey, if you do well in this event, you win everything. And the stick is you could very well lose your position as an incumbent with us. Mm-hmm. So that's typically where I'll start. In terms of really looking for quick wins among that spend analysis, I think the really important thing to do is consider, how you're classifying the suppliers that you're looking at. So everybody will be familiar with taking a look at classifications in terms of, commodity codes, SIC codes, NAIC codes, UNSPSC. The other really important thing to do is make sure you're classifying the suppliers in terms of what does that purchase mean to you. Typical direction we go is how important is that product to your own ROI and the products and services you sell, and also how likely is it that you'll run into risks in the marketplace when you look for it.
Now, how important, you mentioned some taxonomies there. How important is a taxonomy at this stage? Because you can spend an awful long time categorizing all of your spend, obviously. When you're looking for quick wins, you don't necessarily have the months it sometimes takes to do that. So what's the balance between making sure that you have got appropriate and adequate spend categorization so you can action it without necessarily going too far and digging too deep into a perfect taxonomy?
Sure. And this is a pretty big topic, and a lot of people do ask, what taxonomy should I use? Should I go with a pre-developed UNSPSC? Should I develop my own from scratch? At this stage in the game, what I typically suggest is really a two-part. One, in terms of the type of categorization we're doing, I think it's fine at this introductory level to use largely a pre-developed taxonomy. But what I do always say, even if you're not developing a new taxonomy from scratch, we do want to make sure that we're looking at category groups and a few rules of thumb. So one of those rules of thumb, are we going to engage two suppliers in the same go-to-market event? Mm-hmm. Would we use the same strategies and negotiation levers when we're working with them? And really, three, do we anticipate roughly an even savings range between the two, all things equal, and success on both parts? If we're saying yes to all three of those, really you should be grouping those suppliers within a specific category. And I think the really important thing here as well, the falling of a SIC code or NAICS codes or UNSPSC is that they're not really built around procurement's needs. Yeah. So the rules of thumb that I'm talking about, that's really kind of a way to say we need a taxonomy that works for procurement and that informs procurement strategy specifically.
Mm-hmm. And that might be different than a taxonomy that already exists in the general ledger, for example.
Correct. Yeah. And the other issue that I see a lot, a lot of categories and taxonomies can get very, very in the weeds. There's a very strong possibility that people get paralysis by analysis when they're trying to get too deep of a level of detail. Easy example of that, if I'm looking for quick win opportunities, one area that's really strong is office supplies in the admin space. Do I really care how many blue felt tip pens or black ballpoint pens I'm buying, what brand they are? No, that's not necessary at this level. When we're looking to gauge an opportunity, all I want to know is I have, three suppliers in this space. I think they could all benefit from being consolidated and taken out to market competitively. That's what I need to know at this point. The rest is important, but comes later.
And Brian, I think it's really interesting that you talked about the fact that even some of the most commonly known taxonomies and categorization structures within procurement were not really built for procurement's purpose. And maybe they don't have the best natural connection between segmenting our spend, segmenting our supply base, and then moving directly from that to actual strategies that we can carry out. How do you recommend that procurement teams look at the way that they're breaking down that spend and to start preparing themselves to actually take action, maybe even looking at the different frameworks and sourcing technologies that they have at their disposal to start thinking about the characteristics of each category of spend and pairing that up with appropriate actions?
Sure. I think this is a really important point where procurement needs to, obviously develop some level of subject matter expertise in the categories they're considering, but, B, really starts to develop those internal stakeholder relationships that are going to be critical, not just to understand a category of spend, but also make sure we're working with teams to implement successfully. And I'll give you an example of that. When you look at a taxonomy in the printed material space or the promotional item space, they're going to be very far apart in most taxonomies because a lot of these taxonomies are based on what a company produces or really how a company produces their product in the case of SIC and NAICS codes. Is that really appropriate? Well, when we talk to marketing team members, a lot of times we'll find that the suppliers that they're using for printed materials are also their providers of promotional goods. If I'm a printer and I'm making pamphlets for you to take to your next event, if I can get a relationship with a promo item company, that benefits me, and it also benefits you in having one-stop shopping. So developing a marketing category taxonomy that's built around what we see in the market is very important.
What about approaches that it's interesting you talk about these relationships. What about approaches that go beyond sort of traditional strategic sourcing? Things like group purchasing organizations, refer to them as GPOs, or even implementing something like a sourcing desk internally for relatively low risk, low dollar spend. Do those encourage sort of a higher level of spend categorization because you can cover more products and services underneath them?
Sure, and I'm actually glad you brought that up. I think a really important area to talk about, really now, but even in the best of times. You mentioned a couple traits, one being low cost items, and two being relatively low risk in the market, so really commoditized items. What we typically find, it's not always that useful to take that traditional strategic sourcing approach with those really high commodity items because there's just not enough meat on the bone. Most times, procurement teams are going to spend a lot more money just managing those purchases than the purchases themselves are worth, right? So when we talk about things like sourcing desks or GPOs or really any process automation or moving things away from procurement's purview, that's helpful. The best we can do to reduce costs among those low spend commodity items is to get them away from procurement. So GPOs, sourcing desks, on the technology side, having something like a punch out catalog and making sure that approval routing is automated to the greatest degree possible. These are all great ways to really streamline the process, A, cutting costs, but B, letting procurement kind of elevate their own role away from the tactical to more of a strategic role within a company itself.
Now, as you do that, do you see that there are still savings opportunities to be had in the short term around that? The smaller spend, the tail spend, is it more around demand management and perhaps trying to stop that spend altogether versus doing, 3 bids and a buy and negotiations? But, when you're doing that, you're obviously dealing with a higher volume and the returns, at least on a per transaction basis, aren't as high.
Sure. Yeah, we usually will see some level of savings, especially if we're talking about a GPO. Really, your mileage will vary in terms of what you get from a GPO, but certainly for anybody listening who has a smaller company and doesn't have the buying power or leverage that a bigger purchaser will, a GPO is a great way to really tag along and get the value of their spend power.
Mm-hmm. Now, when you think about certain categories, so as you've done your spend categorization, so at least you can see where the spend is now, it's categorized. As you're thinking again in the context of those early waves, what kind of characteristics do you look for in a category that suggests that there may be opportunities to at least do some further due diligence when it comes to quick wins and getting quick results?
Sure. I'll break this down into really two parts. There's quick wins on an internal perspective and also quick wins on more of an external perspective. When it comes to kind of looking at things we can do within an organization, what I really define as quick win is what can we do to really quickly understand our own inventory and take action that won't necessarily have a high risk to the organization. So I'll give you an example of that. Typically in the telecom space, if you have a good number of phone lines or internet circuits, it can be a lot of work to prepare for a go-to-market event. So going to market with an RFQ or RFP, finding the right suppliers to offer that service, and actually running the event. Everybody's familiar with AT&T and other companies that aren't necessarily the most responsive in the world, so they can drag things out. And what's the benefit? We might get, let's just say 10 to 15% savings after a number of months going external. That can be very powerful. But when we take a look at a more quick win style internal project, one thing we always like to do, give me a list of your phone numbers. Let's actually call them and see what happens.
Yeah.
What we typically find is, for every 100 telephone lines a company has, there's a good chance that 25 of them ring to nowhere or aren't actually in use. And even beyond that, there's a really real chance that you might have canceled a line a number of years ago and are still paying long distance service on it. Something I actually have seen several times. So when we're looking at that internal approach, doing that phone number audit can be done in a week, and I've already found 25% savings just by getting rid of inventory that I don't need.
Yeah.
So that's more of the internal side. And on the external side, like we talked about, what can we do on the commoditized product perspective? So things like admin, things like MRO, these are areas that we can very quickly either go to market with a very quick RFQ or go to something like a GPO or a punch-out catalog to really get savings very quickly without having too much of a negative risk impact on our companies.
Now, it's interesting, Brian, when you talk about separating out the internal versus external opportunities and remembering that our focus today is on quick wins, right? Anytime you don't necessarily have to involve that many moving pieces or external parties, you can always go faster. And your story about the phone lines, because I had jotted down a note while you were talking, the 25 out of 100. As a person in procurement, I think I would be so torn between this is literally the best thing that has ever happened to me, discovering this, and thinking, oh my gosh, how did we let this happen? But what an amazing opportunity just to kind of improve sort of the general hygiene and spend management that's taking place. How would you say the opportunity breaks down between what procurement can do purely internally through demand management, like you said, looking at inventory, doing some of this digging through, making sure that you're both getting and need everything that you pay for through a telecom contract? What would you say is sort of the breakout versus what you can do internally versus externally?
It's going to vary a lot by category. I would say that, for some categories on the purchase side, or let me ask on the other side, on the service side, a lot of companies are looking at what can I bring in-house, especially on the marketing side. What can we internalize instead of going to a partner with? Anytime there's more of a service-related component, it can be pretty high. When it comes to products, obviously we're looking more at an external event. But I would say for any procurement team that's looking for strategic sourcing opportunities or really comprehensive cost savings opportunities, we're going to want to try to split this 50-50 in terms of our attention. And a lot of times I talked about making sure we have good relationships with stakeholders internally. This will also come out in the relationships we have with suppliers as well. So when we're thinking about really strategic suppliers, I don't necessarily want to focus an external go-to-market event with my really key strategic suppliers that are a really ingrained part of my business. What I do want to talk to them about is what can we do together to look for those internal opportunities. One example of that is if you're a very big purchaser of a strategic supplier's product, what can we do to make updates and customizations to that product that benefit us? How can we kind of work together in that R&D element? Also, we have a process that supplier's involved with, or that supplier's product or service is involved with. Bring them into our training, bring them into our process discussions. Where do you think we could see some more efficiency gains? So I think it's really going to be a mix of both. What stops procurement teams from really getting into the meat of what those, I don't want to call them hidden, but maybe harder to see internal opportunities is we need to leverage the resources we have, and that's again going to be our stakeholder teams and our supplier teams.
Now, when we talk about those stakeholder teams, because as fast as we want to move, we have to accommodate them as well, right? When procurement talks about quick wins, think about some of the different stakeholder groups that we're likely to have contact with in these categories that you've talked about that sort of lend themselves to the quick win type approach. What do the stakeholders hear when we start talking about quick wins?
Sure. I think the overall, I'll start with the kind of the high level. I think most stakeholder teams, when they hear procurement wants to come in and make a change, is they hear trouble, to put it very simply.
Run!
Yep. I think we have a little bit of a bad rap when it comes to some teams. They view us as a group that doesn't necessarily understand what they're trying to do or what their goals are. I hate to use the term bean counter, but a lot of times I think we come across as a team of bean counters in terms of focusing too much on reducing costs at the expense of quality, which is always going to be an issue. So really what I think is really critical to do is making sure that procurement is really controlling the optics of these quick win opportunities. So going back to things like commoditized admin or MRO purchases, these are things that stakeholder groups don't want to deal with either. What we want to convince them of is, the product you need, the quality that it needs to have, the specs it needs to have. What if we could get rid of everything you needed to worry about when it came to those buys? Cut out procurement from your lives as much as possible. I think that's very important. From a marketing perspective, what can we do to boost your ROI in every marketing dollar spent as quickly as possible? They don't care about cost savings. They want to know, how can we get the most bang for our buck? So if procurement can approach it from that perspective, here's changes we can make this month to increase the bang you're getting on your marketing dollars, they're going to like that.
Well, Brian, I want to thank you, first of all, for the tips that you have provided us and some of the benefits of your experiences in really starting to think about wave plans and where to look for quick wins. I just had one final question to kind of wrap up. As you're starting to build out your wave plan and you have quick wins on there, what do we really mean by quick? Are we talking about immediate savings? Are you talking about, you're still probably not going to see any return or any benefit from this from 3 months to 6 months? What's kind of the general rule of thumb that you take?
Sure. I'm going to look for opportunities that can close within the quarter that I'm working in. Mm-hmm. And I think the key here isn't necessarily how much money is behind those wins. I think it could potentially be a lower amount. The real benefit of quick wins is it gets the ball rolling and it gets the organization behind procurement. Right. So if procurement can, take a small set of spend and within a month or two turn around, a good savings percentage, even if it's a small dollar amount, we're starting to build up credibility within our companies that, we can accomplish our mission, kind of paving the way for those longer term opportunities that might be several months.
So Brian, my final question is, if listeners would like to connect with you, reach out directly, what would be the best place for them to find you?
Sure. They can find me on LinkedIn under Brian Seipel, and also give a call to Corcentric.com. We also have a blog, strategicsourcer.com, that they can hear more from me and the rest of the team from.
Okay, great. Well, I'm going to put those links in our show notes for today's episode. Those are going to be at artofprocurement.com/podcast. That's artofprocurement.com/podcast. Brian, one last time, and Kelly as well, I want to thank you both for joining me today. I want to thank you for listening in to Kelly and I's conversation today with Brian. And the big takeaway that I want to highlight, and this is something that we've talked about recently on the podcast, is that the most immediate cost savings opportunities may relate to demand management, or we're paying for services that we don't use, like the telecom example that Brian shared. After all, we save 100% of the money that we don't need to spend. Well, to subscribe to our weekly newsletter and never miss an episode, go to artofprocurement.com/subscribe. And you can also find our back catalogue of 318 podcasts from the past 5 years at artofprocurement.com/podcast.